On a warm spring afternoon in 1985, 8-year-old Thomas "Tommy" Hale crouched in the patchy grass of his family's modest backyard, the sun casting long shadows from the old oak tree as he drove his battered red toy truck through the dirt. Inside the house, his mother, Margaret, stood at the laundry basket in the living room, folding Gerald's work shirts while humming a tune half forgotten from her childhood. Out on the back porch, Gerald tightened the hinge on the screen door, the faint squeak of metal blending with the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass from the neighbor's yard, and for a moment, everything felt safe and ordinary. When Margaret's voice called out for Tommy to come in and wash up for dinner, it carried the casual warmth of countless evenings before. But there was no answering. "Coming, Mom." No scuffling footsteps across the porch. Frowning, she set the folded shirt aside and stepped out into the yard, brushing her hands on her jeans. The gate stood slightly ajar, swaying almost imperceptibly in the breeze, its latch hanging loose. Just inside the opening lay one small wheel from Tommy's truck, detached as if it had been tugged too hard. "Tommy!" she called again, a thread of unease tightening her voice. Still no answer. Gerald, sensing her alarm, put down his screwdriver and joined her in the yard, scanning the corners where their son often liked to hide. The sandbox was empty, the patch of daisies where he sometimes plucked flowers untouched. Margaret's pulse quickened. She stepped through the gate into the narrow side yard, her eyes darting toward the street. The sound of their neighbor's dog barking carried over the fence, sharp and persistent. Gerald checked the front yard, his voice rising as he called Tommy's name over and over. Within minutes, that quiet suburban calm fractured. Margaret's feet carried her up and down the street, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a small boy with sandy brown hair, wearing a striped t-shirt and grass-stained sneakers. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some carrying flashlights though the sun had not yet set, others joining Gerald in searching the alleys and hedgerows. Someone called the police, and soon patrol cars were gliding slowly through the neighborhood, headlights sweeping over lawns and driveways. The scent of dinner from nearby homes mixed uneasily with the metallic tang of rising fear. Margaret clutched the wheel from Tommy's truck in her hand as if it were a lifeline, her knuckles white. She told herself he might have wandered to a friend's house, that he would be back any minute, smiling sheepishly. But as the minutes bled into an hour, a hollow dread settled in her chest. The light began to fade, the air cooling with the onset of evening, and the glow of police flashlights illuminated the grass, where Tommy's small footprints ended abruptly at the open gate. Somewhere in the darkening streets, voices continued to call his name, each repetition sounding less like hope and more like desperation. By the time the first police car rolled to a stop in front of the Hale home on that April evening in 1985, the neighborhood had already mobilized into a desperate search party. Porch lights flicked on one by one, casting soft halos across driveways and lawns as neighbors stepped out with flashlights, their voices carrying into the growing darkness as they called Tommy's name over and over. Margaret stood near the open gate, clutching the worn wheel from his toy truck, her fingers stiff and trembling, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the fence, as if he might step back through at any moment. Gerald moved quickly between clusters of neighbors, directing them toward the wooded trail behind the houses, his voice firm but tight with strain. 2 uniformed officers approached, asking questions about what Tommy had been wearing, what direction he might have gone, whether he had any reason to run away. Margaret answered as best she could, her voice quavering, insisting he would never leave the yard without telling her. A pair of search dogs arrived, their handlers moving briskly as they guided them through the gate and into the yard, the dogs' noses close to the ground, tails stiff. Within minutes, they were pulling toward the tree line at the edge of the neighborhood. Officers set up a perimeter, others knocking on doors, peering into sheds and garages, asking residents to check under decks and inside basements. Down the street, the murmur of voices and the rhythmic beam of flashlights swept over every patch of grass and gravel. A small pond just beyond the woods became the focus of a team that worked with grim efficiency, lowering equipment into the water, their silhouettes stark against the last streaks of sunset. Margaret found herself drawn toward the edge of the scene, her feet moving without thought, the scent of damp earth and pond water mingling in the cool air. Somewhere behind her, Gerald's voice broke as he called for Tommy again, the sound catching in his throat. Hours passed, the temperature dropping, the night pressing in. The steady hum of crickets was broken by the occasional bark of the search dogs and the clipped radio chatter of officers coordinating the search grid. Margaret's hope flickered stubbornly, whispering that he could still come walking out of the darkness with a shy smile, muddy shoes, and an innocent explanation. But as midnight approached, the mood shifted. The searchlights grew harsher against the blackness, and the presence of more officers and equipment signaled an unspoken truth. Neighbors' voices grew quieter, conversations turning to murmurs, their eyes avoiding Margaret's, as if the weight of their own doubt was too much to share. The dogs returned to their handlers, panting heavily, their earlier urgency now replaced with an unsettling stillness. Margaret stood frozen near the gate where it had all begun, her breath clouding in the cold night air. The wheel of the red truck pressed into her palm, as if she could somehow hold her boy's life together by refusing to let go. In the days following Tommy's disappearance in that spring of 1985, the focus of the investigation shifted toward a man who had long been a quiet, unsettling presence on the block. Warren Blake, a man in his mid-40s with thinning hair and a deep, sallow complexion, lived alone in a weathered house 2 doors down from the Hales. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were clipped, his eyes avoiding contact. Neighbors remembered whispers about his past, small-time trouble with the law, a few arrests for theft and trespassing in the late 1970s, and one unsettling incident involving an argument with a teenager that ended in police intervention. When officers knocked on his door 3 days after Tommy vanished, Warren's slow, deliberate steps and hesitant greeting did little to ease suspicion. He told them he had been out of town that afternoon, visiting a cousin in a city nearly 2 hours away. But when pressed for details, the times shifted, the name of the cousin changed, and he could not provide a phone number or address. His eyes darted toward the floor whenever Tommy's name was mentioned, and his hands fidgeted in the pocket of his worn flannel shirt. The police obtained a warrant to search his property, and the sight of uniformed officers and detectives combing through the unkempt yard sent a ripple of unease through the neighborhood. They pried open the warped shed in the back, its hinges groaning in protest, revealing stacks of rusted tools, old tires, and boxes filled with odds and ends covered in dust. The basement, dim and smelling faintly of mildew, was emptied of old furniture and crates, each item checked with methodical care. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, their whispers carried by the wind, each person watching for the slightest sign that something had been found. But as the hours stretched on, the officers emerged with nothing more than a few bags of unrelated evidence, things that could not be tied to Tommy or his disappearance. Margaret stood in her own driveway, watching the scene with a mixture of dread and hope, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if holding her body together could keep her from breaking apart. When the lead detective walked over to speak with her, his expression was grave but apologetic. They had nothing solid, no proof that Warren had been involved. Without evidence, they could not hold him. That night, Warren's house remained dark, his curtains drawn tight, and his shadowy figure seen only briefly through the flicker of a television screen. The neighborhood was left in a state of quiet tension, suspicion simmering beneath the surface, the unspoken thought lingering in many minds that if Warren had been involved, he had hidden his tracks well. For Margaret, it was another blow in a series of heartbreaks, the wheel from Tommy's truck still resting on her nightstand, the unanswered questions multiplying as the search for her son pressed on without the clarity she so desperately needed. Weeks slipped by in the spring and summer of 1985, each one stretching longer than the last, and the once relentless search for Tommy began to lose momentum. The bright flyers that had been stapled to telephone poles and taped in shop windows now hung in tatters, their edges curling and their colors washed out by sun and rain, until Tommy's smiling face was little more than a faded ghost staring back at passers-by. The reward money, once announced in bold letters and spoken about with urgency, went unclaimed, its promise of answers quietly dissolving into the background of a community weary from too many unanswered questions. Gerald threw himself into work, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark, his shoulders hunched, his words fewer with each passing day, as if speaking about anything outside the bare minimum required too much effort. He no longer lingered on the back porch in the evenings, no longer fixed the small things around the house that had once been his way of caring for it. Margaret, in contrast, clung to the routines that tethered her to Tommy's presence. She refused to change a single thing in his room. The bed stayed unmade, just as it had been the morning he vanished. A stray sock still lay crumpled near the dresser, and the bookshelf remained crowded with the same haphazard arrangement of picture books and toy dinosaurs. Each morning she cracked the door open just enough to peek inside, telling herself she was letting in fresh air for when he came home, though deep down she knew it was to reassure herself that his space had not been touched by anyone else's hands. The police visits grew less frequent, the calls to the station yielding the same tired phrases about following leads and keeping the file open. By the first snowfall of that year, the investigation had slowed to a crawl, and the Hale home sat under a blanket of cold silence. On a bitter December afternoon, Margaret stood in the kitchen, staring at the thin stream of coffee pouring into her mug when the phone rang. It was the detective assigned to the case, his tone professional but distant, informing her that the file was being moved to inactive status. They would still take tips, he said, but without new evidence, there was little more they could do. She thanked him in a voice that felt foreign in her own throat, hung up the phone, and stood in the middle of the kitchen listening to the tick of the clock on the wall. Outside, the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, softening the edges of the world, but inside, the sharpness of loss was as cutting as ever. The gate in the backyard still swayed slightly when the wind caught it, and the wheel from Tommy's red truck still sat on her nightstand, a silent reminder that time could pass, seasons could change, but the absence at the heart of their home would not fade. Years rolled by, each one blurring into the next, marked less by holidays or seasons than by the quiet persistence of absence that hung over the Hale home. In the spring of 1994, nearly 9 years after Tommy vanished, Gerald collapsed at work from a heart attack, leaving Margaret alone in the house that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The rooms seemed to grow larger without him, the silence heavier, the air colder even in summer. She kept the phone number the same, her name printed in the directory as it had always been, unwilling to risk the possibility that someone might try to call with news about Tommy and not be able to find her. Every ring of the phone sent a jolt through her chest, though more often than not it was a telemarketer or a wrong number. Still, she answered every call, her voice steady, always just in case. The police station she had once visited so often began to change as detectives retired, their names scratched out on old business cards in her drawer. New officers listened politely when she stopped in but spoke with the careful detachment of those who had inherited a case they knew they would likely never solve. The box of evidence, photographs, and newspaper clippings she kept in the hall closet grew heavier with each passing year, though its contents never changed. Outside, the neighborhood evolved in ways that made her feel like a stranger in her own street. Young families moved into houses where familiar neighbors had once lived. Children played in yards that had been quiet for decades, and yet no one spoke of the boy who had once been here and then was gone. Margaret became something of a fixture, the solitary woman who still tended her flower beds with meticulous care and waved at passers-by but rarely invited anyone in. Tommy's room remained untouched, a place she visited on quiet afternoons to sit on the edge of his bed, breathing in the faint, aging scent of his childhood. Sometimes she would run her hand over the quilt, tracing the worn seams, imagining the weight of him under it. The wheel from his red truck still sat on her nightstand, the same way it had the night she placed it there, a small piece of him she could hold when the ache grew too sharp. As the years passed, Tommy's case shifted from an active investigation to just another cold file in a cabinet somewhere, its edges yellowing, its tabs marked by dust. But for Margaret, there was nothing cold about it. The loss lived in her bones, in the air she breathed, in the unending question that shadowed every day. Time might have dulled the urgency for others, but for her, it was as fresh as the evening she first stepped into the yard and found the gate ajar, the world she knew already gone. In the early months of 2023, the house next door to Margaret's, the one that had once belonged to Warren Blake, was sold after years of sitting empty and weather-worn. She had watched from her front window as the for sale sign went up, expecting it to linger there like so many others on the street. But within weeks, a young couple, Daniel and Rebecca Miles, had moved in, their energy and optimism spilling over the fence in the form of bright plans and the scent of fresh paint. The property had long carried an unspoken shadow for Margaret, a reminder of questions never answered, but the newcomers seemed untouched by the weight of the past. They talked cheerfully about renovations, waved each time they saw her in the yard, and soon hired crews to tackle the work that had been neglected for decades. The yard was cleared of dead shrubs, the sagging porch steps replaced, and the faded clapboard siding was given a new coat of pale blue paint that made the old place look almost welcoming. Inside, the work was more invasive. Margaret heard the steady hum of saws, the thud of hammers, and the low murmur of contractors discussing outdated wiring, warped floorboards, and plumbing that had not been properly serviced since before the turn of the century. One cold morning, as she carried a bag of birdseed from her car to the porch, she overheard one of the workers explaining to Rebecca that the old septic system was in worse condition than they had thought. Rusted pipes, crumbling seals, and strange blockages meant the entire line would have to be dug up and replaced. Margaret felt an involuntary chill creep over her skin at the mention of the septic tank, her mind flicking back to the countless times the police had searched Warren's property without finding anything. She shook the thought away, telling herself it was just old habit, a reflex after so many years of living beside a place tied in her mind to loss. Over the next few days, heavy equipment rumbled in the yard, digging deep trenches through the frozen earth. Pipes were pulled out, their metal flaking under the touch, and workers moved carefully around the crumbling concrete lid of the septic tank. Daniel and Rebecca watched the progress from the porch, their breath curling in the crisp air, chatting about how glad they would be to have the whole system modernized. Margaret stayed mostly indoors, though she found herself glancing through her curtains more often than she intended, drawn by the sight of the ground being opened for the first time in decades. She could not have said why, but there was something unsettling in watching Earth that had remained undisturbed since 1985 finally give way. Beneath the normalcy of construction and repair, she felt the faint stirrings of unease, as though the house next door still held a secret it had kept buried far too long. The morning air was brittle with cold when Chris Donnelly, the plumber hired to overhaul the Miles's septic system, crouched beside a trench that had been dug deep into the backyard. He had been working steadily for hours, replacing a collapsed section of pipe that crumbled under his gloved hands, when his wrench struck something that did not sound like rusted metal or compacted earth. Leaning closer, he saw the dull curve of an object wedged awkwardly in the line, its edges catching faint glints of light beneath the grime. With careful effort, he loosened the soil around it and pulled free a small, corroded metal lunchbox, its once bright paint eaten away by decades underground. The weight of it in his hands was strange, heavier than it should have been for something so small. Rebecca, watching from the porch with a mug of coffee clasped between her fingers, called down to ask what he had found, but Chris barely heard her. Setting the lunchbox on the ground beside him, he pried at the rusted clasp with the flat edge of his tool until it finally gave way with a reluctant snap. The lid creaked open, releasing a faint, sour scent of age and damp. Inside, nestled in a bed of discolored cloth, lay a child's worn sneaker, its once white canvas now mottled with stains, the laces stiff and frayed. Beside it was a small plastic dinosaur, its green paint chipped away at the tail, and a photograph, the paper curling at the edges but the image still visible. The boy in the picture was young, with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile that seemed frozen in a moment of uncomplicated joy. Chris felt a prickling run down the back of his neck, a sense that he was holding something that had not been meant to see the light again. Rebecca came closer now, her footsteps crunching in the frost, and when she saw the items, her voice faltered mid-sentence. Daniel appeared behind her, drawn by her silence, and the three of them stood in an uneasy circle around the lunchbox, the weight of what it might mean settling heavily over them. Chris's mind turned briefly to stories he had overheard about the house's history, vague mentions of the previous owner's strange behavior, but the details were hazy. What he did know, with sudden certainty, was that this was not something to set aside or dismiss. He reached for his phone, his fingers cold against the screen, as he dialed the local police department, his voice steady, but edged with something he could not quite name as he explained what he had found. Within the hour, the yard would be filled with uniformed officers and marked cars, the lunchbox sealed into an evidence bag, and the first thread in a mystery, long buried since 1985, would be tugged loose, setting in motion the unraveling of secrets the ground had kept for nearly 4 decades. Chris did not hesitate once the significance of what he had uncovered began to take shape in his mind. Standing in the cold backyard with the corroded lunchbox now sitting open at his feet, he pulled out his phone and called the police, his voice calm but carrying the urgency of someone who understood that what he had found was not just debris from a forgotten corner of the yard. Within half an hour, the low hum of the neighborhood was replaced by the sharp crackle of police radios and the crunch of boots on frozen grass as 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb. Officers spoke briefly with Chris before moving in to cordon off the area, unspooling bright yellow tape around the open trench while the young couple, Daniel and Rebecca Miles, stood off to the side on their porch, wrapped in coats, the shock clear in their faces. They whispered to each other, glancing toward the disturbed earth as if trying to reconcile the cheerful home they had been building with the possibility that something sinister had been buried just beyond their back steps. Before long, a forensic team arrived, their white coveralls stark against the muted winter colors of the yard. They photographed the lunchbox from every angle before carefully lifting it into a clear evidence bag. The sneaker, the small plastic dinosaur, and the photograph were handled with the kind of deliberate care that spoke to their potential importance. Later that evening, the call came to Margaret. She had been at her kitchen table with a cup of tea when the phone rang, and though the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, the mention of Tommy's name sent her heart into her throat. The officer explained that DNA testing on the fibers from the sneaker had matched samples collected from Tommy's clothing back in 1985. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone, her knuckles white, the words sinking in slowly. The match was not a discovery of his fate, not yet, but it was a tangible link to him after all these years, a piece of proof that her boy had been here, that something had happened in that yard. She pressed her free hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer against her palm, and asked questions the officer could not yet answer. Outside her window, the street was quiet, the bare branches of the trees swaying gently in the evening wind. But she could almost hear the echoes of the past moving closer, pressing in. Back at the Miles house, the forensic team continued their careful work under floodlights, the air filled with the faint hum of the generator. Neighbors had begun to gather in small clusters along the sidewalk, their voices low as they speculated, remembering the boy who had vanished in the spring of 1985 and wondering if, after all this time, the ground might finally be ready to give up its secrets. The following morning, while the evidence from the Miles yard was being logged and examined, detectives pored over property records at the county office, tracing the chain of ownership for the land where the corroded lunchbox had been unearthed. The yellowed pages and microfilm reels confirmed what many in the neighborhood already suspected in whispers. In the spring of 1985, the property had belonged to Warren Blake, the reclusive neighbor whose name had once been spoken with unease during the height of the search for Tommy Hale. The discovery set off a renewed urgency within the department. Files that had not been touched in decades were pulled from storage, their folders brittle at the edges, the handwriting in them faded but still legible. Detectives revisited old witness statements, rereading accounts from neighbors who had at the time reported seeing Warren outside near his shed on the day Tommy vanished. One statement in particular stood out, describing how the gate between the Hale and Blake properties had been broken that spring, its latch hanging loose, making it possible for someone to pass between the two yards without struggle. That detail, dismissed as trivial in 1985, now took on a new weight. The officers noted how it could have provided a direct path from where Tommy had been playing to where the lunchbox, and possibly more, had been hidden. In the quiet hum of the records room, the air seemed charged with the feeling that something long dormant had been disturbed. Back at her kitchen table, Margaret listened in tense silence as an officer updated her over the phone, explaining the connection between the property and Warren Blake. Her mind reeled back to that time, to the days when she had watched police search his yard, her heart caught between hope and dread, and to the nights when she had lain awake, listening to the faint creak of the wind against the fence, wondering if Tommy had been closer than she dared imagine. Across town, detectives mapped out a plan to re-interview surviving witnesses, some of whom had moved away but could still be found. The past was not gone, they knew. It lingered in memory, in overlooked details, in the subtle threads of truth that had been ignored or forgotten. As the winter light faded outside the station windows, the team agreed that the broken gate, the proximity of the properties, and the presence of Tommy's belongings in what had once been Warren Blake's yard formed a line of connection too clear to ignore. Though Warren himself had not lived there for years, the shadow of his presence stretched long across the decades, and for the first time in a very long while, the investigation no longer felt like a slow drift through unanswered questions. It felt like movement, the kind that stirred both hope and fear as the walls of silence built since 1985 began at last to crack. Under the pale wash of winter daylight, the backyard of the Miles home had been transformed into a controlled excavation site, the hum of machinery mingling with the low murmur of investigators and the crisp snap of evidence bags being sealed. The septic tank, long buried and corroded from decades of neglect, had already been partially exposed during the plumbing work. But now, a team of forensic specialists moved with deliberate precision, widening the trench and brushing away layers of earth until the full structure lay before them. It was then that one of the technicians paused, his gloved hand tracing the edge of a section that did not match the rest, a panel of concrete smoother and more uniform, its seal too clean to have been the work of time. As the team chipped away at the surrounding material, the compartment beneath slowly revealed itself, shallow and deliberately concealed, the edges pressed tight, as though meant to hide something from both sight and scent. When the slab was finally pried loose, a stillness settled over the yard, the kind of silence that falls when everyone present understands they are standing at the threshold of something irreversible. Inside, bundled in the remnants of deteriorated fabric, lay partial human remains, their small scale leaving little doubt even before testing. The air was heavy with the damp, metallic scent of the Earth's long-kept secret, and even the seasoned officers stepped back, their expressions taut. The remains were handled with the utmost care, lifted gently into a container for transport to the lab. Margaret received the call later that evening, the voice on the other end measured and somber, confirming that dental records and DNA had identified the remains as belonging to Tommy. She sat in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gripping the edge of the table, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The words the officer spoke blurred into one long thread of sound, but one detail anchored itself with unshakable clarity. The condition of the remains suggested Tommy had been placed in the compartment within hours of disappearing on that warm afternoon in 1985. This meant that while the neighborhood had searched, while she had called his name into the dusk, he had been mere feet away, hidden in a place no one had thought to look. The knowledge carved into her a fresh kind of grief, one sharper than the slow ache she had carried all these years. Back at the excavation site, the forensic team worked under floodlights, photographing every angle, collecting soil samples, and sealing away evidence. The wind cut across the open yard, carrying with it the weight of a truth buried for nearly 4 decades. And for the first time since that day in 1985, the investigation stood not on speculation or rumor, but on the undeniable presence of Tommy himself. The arrest came quietly, without the flashing lights or shouting voices that might have accompanied such a moment decades earlier. In the winter of 2023, detectives arrived at a modest nursing home on the edge of town, the air crisp with frost as they stepped through its automatic doors. Warren Blake, now in his early 80s, sat in a wheelchair near the window of a sunlit lounge, his thin frame draped in a faded cardigan, a book resting in his lap. He was living under an assumed name, one the staff used without knowing its history. But when the detectives approached and addressed him by his real name, his head lifted sharply, eyes narrowing in instant recognition. The words of the arrest were spoken calmly, but the presence of the evidence, the recovered lunchbox, the DNA match, and the remains found in the septic tank of his former home, left no room for confusion about why they were there. At first, Warren's voice was steady as he denied knowing anything about the items found, his gaze sliding away when asked about the broken gate between his property and the Hales in 1985. When pressed further, he shifted his account, claiming that Tommy's death had been an accident, that the boy had wandered into his yard and somehow suffered a fatal fall. His tone carried a rehearsed quality, as though he had told himself this version many times over the years. But the investigators, hardened by experience, recognized the gaps and contradictions in his story. The deliberate concealment of the remains, the placement of personal belongings in a sealed compartment, and the decades of silence were not the actions of someone overwhelmed by a sudden tragedy. They were, in their view, the careful measures of a man determined to hide a deliberate act. As Warren was wheeled down the hallway toward the waiting patrol car, staff members and residents watched in stunned silence, the hum of the building seeming to fade beneath the weight of what they had just witnessed. Across town, Margaret received the news from a detective who spoke with a mix of formality and empathy, explaining that Warren Blake was in custody and would face charges connected to Tommy's death. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around the phone as if it might steady her. The name she had long associated with suspicion and unanswered questions now bound to a tangible act of justice. Though it was not yet a conviction, it was the first time in nearly 4 decades that someone was being held accountable. Back at the station, Warren was booked, his frail hands inked for fingerprints, the camera flash briefly illuminating his lined face. Outside, the cold wind swept through the streets, carrying with it the quiet murmur of a community that had lived under the shadow of 1985, now watching as the man at the center of it was finally brought into the light. When the call came from the detective, Margaret had been sitting in her living room with the afternoon light spilling across the carpet, the familiar hush of the house wrapping around her like it always had. The voice on the other end was calm but deliberate, carrying the weight of words that could not be softened. Warren Blake was in custody, they told her, and they had recovered belongings, Tommy's belongings, from the excavation next door. For a long moment, she said nothing, her hand tightening around the receiver as though she could anchor herself against the sudden rush of air that seemed to leave the room. The detective asked if she wanted to come to the station to see them, and her answer was a quiet but immediate yes. The drive there was a blur of grey streets and bare winter trees, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly she could feel the ache travel up her arms. Inside the station, the hum of computers and the faint scent of paper and coffee barely registered. An officer led her to a small room where an evidence table had been cleared. Laid out with careful precision were the objects that had surfaced from the soil after 38 years. The small, worn sneaker she remembered lacing up countless times, the chipped plastic dinosaur he had once insisted on carrying to the grocery store, and the faded photograph of him smiling that gap-toothed smile, sunlight caught in his hair. For a moment, she could not move. The years between that spring day in 1985 and now seemed to fold in on themselves, the decades of frozen grief cracking open to reveal the raw, undiluted pain beneath. She reached for the photograph first, her fingers trembling as she lifted it from the table. Holding it against her chest, she closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a heartbeat, that she could will time backwards, that she might open her eyes and see him standing there, alive and whole. The ache that rose in her throat was sharp and relentless, but she did not fight it. She let the tears come, hot and unrestrained, falling onto the laminate surface of the table. The officer in the room stayed silent, giving her the space to breathe through it, to gather the strength she had been forced to call on again and again. When she finally placed the photograph back down, her gaze lingered on the sneaker, the laces stiff and knotted from years of compression, and the dinosaur whose tail still bore the mark where the paint had worn away from his small fingers. These were not just relics. They were fragments of a life cut short, proof that he had been here, that he had been hers. As she left the station, the cold air met her damp cheeks, and she knew that while justice might still be far from complete, she now carried something she had been denied for nearly 4 decades. Pieces of her son returned to her at last. The trial began in the fall of 2024, drawing an air of tense anticipation over the courthouse as people from the community, some who had lived through the events of 1985 and others who only knew the story through whispers, filled the gallery seats. Margaret sat quietly in the second row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the faded photograph of Tommy tucked inside her bag like a talisman. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out the physical evidence, the corroded lunchbox containing Tommy's belongings, the sneaker that bore his DNA, the plastic dinosaur still marked with the wear of his small hands, and the remains discovered in the septic tank that once sat in Warren Blake's yard. They played recordings of his interviews with investigators, where his story shifted and contradicted itself, each version undermining the one before. The jurors listened intently as witnesses from the past came forward, their voices measured but edged with the clarity of memory. Neighbors described his erratic behavior in the days before Tommy disappeared, how he had been seen lingering near the Hale property, muttering under his breath, and pacing his backyard late at night. Others recalled the way he vanished for hours during the first frantic search, returning with an expression they could not forget, tight-lipped, eyes darting, as though measuring each question before answering. The defense attempted to frame Tommy's death as a tragic accident, clinging to Blake's claim that the boy had wandered into his yard and suffered a fatal fall. But the prosecution dismantled the argument piece by piece, pointing to the deliberate concealment of the remains, the sealed compartment in the septic tank, and the decades of silence that followed. The courtroom held a heavy, almost tangible stillness as photographs from 1985 were projected on the screen, showing a smiling Tommy, the image a stark contrast to the clinical evidence that followed. Margaret kept her gaze steady, refusing to look away, her resolve anchored in the need to see the truth carried to its end. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments painted two opposing pictures, one of a man burdened by a tragic mistake, and one of a man who had acted with intent and worked meticulously to hide it. The jury deliberated for 2 days, the weight of nearly 4 decades resting on their verdict. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear and unwavering as she read the words, "Guilty of murder in the first degree." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom, some gasping softly, others bowing their heads. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag, the photograph inside feeling heavier than ever. Outside, as she stepped into the cool autumn air, the courthouse stood against the fading light. And though the verdict could never bring Tommy back, it had given her something she had long been denied. The acknowledgement, in the eyes of the law, of the truth she had always known since that day in 1985. It was a grey morning in the spring of 2025, when Margaret stood beneath the bare branches of the old maple tree in the town cemetery, the ground damp from a night of steady rain. Nearly 40 years had passed since she had last seen her son alive, and now she was preparing to lay him to rest beside Gerald, whose grave had waited all these years for the boy they both had loved. The casket was small, though not as small as it would have been in 1985, and inside it lay what remained of Tommy, the partial remains recovered from the septic tank, handled with care and reverence by the investigators who had worked tirelessly to return him to her. She had chosen a simple pale wood for the coffin, lined with a quilt she had sewn decades ago, its colors still faintly bright despite the years folded away. In her hands, she held the lunchbox that had once been rusted and buried, but was now cleaned and polished, the dents still visible but no longer hidden under layers of corrosion. Inside it were the small treasures that had been found with him, the sneaker, the plastic dinosaur, and the photograph of him smiling in the sun. Before the service began, she stepped forward alone, leaning over the open casket to place the lunchbox inside, her fingers lingering on the lid as though reluctant to let go. Her voice was soft, almost carried away by the wind as she whispered, "You can come home now." Around her, the handful of mourners, old friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed the case, stood in a quiet semicircle, their heads bowed against the chill. The pastor spoke a few words about loss and the long road to closure, but Margaret heard them only in fragments, her mind filled with the sound of Tommy's laughter from a lifetime ago. She thought of the years that had stretched between them, the birthdays missed, the seasons that had turned without him, and the way she had kept his room exactly as it had been, waiting for the day he might walk through the door. Now, at last, he was home, though not in the way she had prayed for. As the casket was lowered into the earth, the soft thud of dirt landing on the lid echoed in the damp air, each sound a final punctuation to the decades of searching and wondering. Margaret's knees felt weak, but she stood firm, watching until the grave was filled and the fresh mound of soil smoothed. She rested her hand on Gerald's headstone for balance, her gaze lingering on the space where his name and Tommy's now lay side by side. The wind stirred through the maple branches above, and in that moment, she felt the quiet certainty that though the years had been cruel and unyielding, love had endured, binding them together beyond the reach of time. In the months following the trial and Tommy's burial in the spring of 2025, Margaret found herself in unfamiliar territory. a life without the constant weight of unanswered questions pressing on her every waking moment. The grief was still there, deep and unshakable, but the sharp edge of uncertainty had finally dulled, replaced by a bittersweet clarity. For nearly 4 decades, she had lived in the limbo of not knowing, her days shaped by a quiet but relentless search for the truth. Now, though the truth was painful, it had allowed her to stand in the present, rather than forever straining toward the past. Wanting to channel her experience into something beyond her own healing, Margaret began volunteering with a non-profit that worked with families of missing children, offering them resources, emotional support, and guidance through the labyrinth of law enforcement and legal processes. At first, she felt hesitant, unsure if she could carry the weight of other people's grief alongside her own. But she quickly realized that her story, Tommy's story, could be a lifeline for others, a testament to persistence when hope feels almost impossible to hold. She spoke at small community gatherings, sharing the lessons she had learned, not in the polished words of a professional, but in the raw, measured cadence of someone who had lived the long, slow ache of waiting. Tommy's case, once a painful mystery that haunted her private world, became a warning to communities about the dangers of complacency and the importance of never letting a child's name fade from memory. Local news outlets began inviting her to speak on anniversaries of unsolved cases, and while she never sought attention, she accepted these opportunities because she knew visibility could mean the difference between a lead gone cold and a break in a case. In her own home, the lunchbox now sat on a shelf in the living room, its dents and worn edges visible, a quiet reminder of the boy who had once carried it and the decades-long fight to bring him back. Visitors often paused to look at it, and Margaret would tell them not only about Tommy, but about the many other children whose stories still waited for resolution. She carried each of those names with her, just as she had carried her sons, determined that they too would not be forgotten. The seasons turned, and the maple tree above Gerald and Tommy's graves cycled through blossoms, green leaves, and bare branches, marking time in a way that felt gentler now. Standing there on quiet afternoons, Margaret would lay her hand on the headstone and speak softly, telling Tommy about the families she had met, the cases she had seen reopened, and the children who had been found. The loss would never vanish, but the love she carried had found a place to grow beyond her own sorrow, and in that she discovered a different kind of peace, one built not on forgetting, but on honoring and fighting for others, just as she had for him.